Welcome back to the deep dive. For as long as humans have been, well, thinking, we've been wrestling with that huge question. What actually makes an action right or wrong?
It seems like it should be simple, right?
Exactly. Philosophers have been chasing this, single foundational idea for morality forever. And you'd think, maybe, that figuring out right and wrong would be easier than, I don't know, quantum physics or advanced math.
But it's proven surprisingly tough. It's strange because you'd expect something practical like morality, something guiding our actions, to start with a clear goal.
Yeah, a clear end point.
Right. But agreeing on that ultimate moral goal, that's been the real sticking point. Unlike sciences where they eventually find those first principles, ethics has struggled.
Which brings us to today. We're diving deep into a major attempt to nail down that principle, John Stuart Mill's Utilitarianism. We're working from an 1879 edition, which itself was reprinted from Fraser's magazine. So, quite the classic text.
And our goal here, really, is to unpack Mill's core argument, the principle of utility, or as he calls it, the greatest happiness principle. We want to see if that can be the foundation for morality.
So we need to get clear on what he actually means by utility and happiness.
Definitely. And tackle the big misunderstandings, the common objections people throw at it. Then figure out, why should we even care? What gives it its binding force?
Right, black fault.
And finally, connect it to something that feels really deep-seated for us, our sense of justice. How does utility square with that?
Okay, think of this as your shortcut, your guide through this major piece of ethical thinking. Let's jump in. What is utilitarianism, according to Mill? Because he flags a big mistake right off the bat.
Yeah, he calls it an ignorant blunder, which is pretty strong language.
Huh.
The most common error is thinking utility is somehow opposed to pleasure. People hear utility and they picture something cold, purely functional, maybe even unpleasant.
Just useful in a boring way.
Exactly, which is completely backward. Mill is very clear. The theory that accepts utility, or the greatest happiness principle, says actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness.
Okay, so right actions lead to happiness.
And wrong actions lead to the reverse of happiness.
And his definition. Happiness is?
Happiness is pleasure and also the absence of pain. Unhappiness is pain and the privation of pleasure, basically, lacking pleasure. So it's fundamentally about pleasure and pain.
Okay, but that definition immediately brings up that classic criticism, right? The whole doctrine worthy only of swine thing. If it's just about pleasure, aren't we just talking about basic animal urges?
Mill saw that coming. He confronts it directly. He says, look, that objection totally misrepresents human beings. It assumes humans are only capable of the same kind of pleasures as, well, a pig.
Which we know isn't true.
Right. The whole reason the comparison feels like an insult is precisely because animal pleasures don't satisfy a human's conception of happiness. Humans are capable of and desire much more.
And this is where Mill makes, I think, his most interesting move. He says it's not just about the amount of pleasure.
Yes, this is crucial. He introduces the idea that the quality of pleasures matters, not just the quantity.
Which makes sense, intuitive.
He thinks it's absurd, really. We judge everything else, food, art, whatever, by both quality and quantity. But then suddenly, when it's pleasure itself, people act like only the amount counts. It doesn't add up.
So how do we judge this quality? Is it just subjective? What I like versus what you like?
Mill proposes a standard. It's the preference of those who are, quote, competently acquainted with both kinds of pleasure.
Meaning people who've actually experienced both.
Exactly. People who've experienced, say, simple physical pleasures,
Right.
the pleasures of the mind, or emotions, or moral action. And if those people consistently prefer one type, even if it comes with a bit more trouble or dissatisfaction,
And that one's higher quality.
that's in the more desirable pleasure.
Yes.
Higher in quality.
And what do these competent judges tend to prefer, according to Mill?
He says they universally prefer the kind of life that uses their higher faculties.
So thinking, feeling deeply, imagination.
Intellect, emotions, imagination, our moral sentiments, exactly, those kinds of engagement.
Which leads to that famous, really striking line he uses.
Oh, yeah. It is better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied.
It's such a powerful image. Why does he say that?
Well, his logic is, the fool or the pig, they only know one side of the story, right? The simpler pleasures.
They haven't experienced the other side.
Whereas Socrates, or the human using higher faculties, knows both. They understand the lower pleasures, but they've also tasted the richness of intellectual life, of complex emotions, of moral purpose. And having known both, Mill argues, They wouldn't trade that capacity for higher pleasures for any amount of the lower ones.
Even if the higher life is harder sometimes.
Even with its potential drawbacks, the capacity itself is just valued more highly by those who understand both.
Okay, so it's a much richer picture than just more pleasure is better. Quality matters, judged by experience. That definitely refines things.
It absolutely does. It moves it way beyond simple hedonism. And another really critical point Mill makes. The standard isn't about maximizing your own personal happiness.
Oh, right. That's important.
It's about the greatest amount of happiness altogether for everyone, or really every sentient being affected.
So sometimes the right thing to do, the utilitarian thing, might actually mean less happiness for me personally.
Potentially, yes. Mill emphasizes that cultivating a noble character, for instance, is hugely valuable, even if being, say, rigorously honest or deeply compassionate sometimes causes you personal pain or sacrifice.
Why is that noble character so important then?
Because a noble character tends to make other people happier. It contributes massively to the overall well-being of the world. The world gains immensely from it.
So, if we put it all together, the ultimate goal, the standard for what's right or wrong,
Is aiming for an existence for all of mankind. And he even includes the whole sentient creation where possible, an existence that's as free from pain and as rich in enjoyments as possible.
enjoyments in both quantity and that crucial element of quality.
Exactly. That's the end game for the greatest happiness principle.
Okay, that lays out the core theory. But, like any big idea, it attracts criticism. Let's dig into some of the main objections Mill tackles. First one. Happiness, especially this rich kind, is just impossible to achieve for most people. It's pie in the sky.
Yeah, Mill thought that was a serious exaggeration. He clarifies, look, utilitarian happiness isn't about being in a constant state of, like, blissful rapture.
That does sound unrealistic.
Totally. He says it's more about having moments of pleasure, experiencing relatively few pains, leading an active life, and importantly, not expecting more from life than it can reasonably deliver. Managing expectations.
So what does he think contributes to a generally satisfied life?
He highlights two key things: tranquility and excitement. He thinks many people can find contentment with quite a bit of peace, even with limited pleasure. Others can handle a fair amount of pain if their life has enough engagement and excitement.
A balance, maybe?
Yeah, or finding the mix that works for you. But he argues a life with a decent share of both, combined with realistic hopes, is actually quite attainable for many.
And what did he see as the main things preventing this?
He points the finger squarely at, and these are his words, wretched education and wretched social arrangements.
Ouch. Strong words again?
He was quite optimistic, though. He believed many major sources of suffering, things like poverty, disease, just bad luck, even human unkindness, are largely conquerable.
Through human effort.
Through human effort, science, better social structures. He really believed that if society got its act together, most people could find sufficient sources of interest and satisfaction to lead happy lives. Especially, he adds, if their minds are cultivated.
Ah, linking back to those higher faculties, finding interest everywhere. Okay, objection number 2. People can live without happiness, and sometimes they even should. Think about self-sacrifice, renunciation. Isn't that often seen as virtuous?
Mill absolutely agrees that living without happiness is possible. He notes many people do it, often involuntarily. And yes, he concedes that choosing to sacrifice your own happiness can be noble. But, and this is the crucial utilitarian but.
There's always a but.
Yeah, yes. The sacrifice only has value if it's for the sake of something.
Okay, and that something has to be what?
It has to be the happiness of other people, or contributing to the means by which others can achieve happiness.
So sacrificing just for the sake of sacrificing.
It's pointless from a utilitarian perspective. It's wasted. If your sacrifice doesn't actually increase, or at least tend to increase, the total sum of happiness in the world, it has no moral value in itself.
The value is in the positive outcome for others, not in the act of suffering itself.
Precisely. Utilitarianism respects the person who makes a sacrifice if it genuinely benefits others' well-being, but it doesn't glorify the suffering itself. Interestingly, he adds a kind of paradoxical point.
Oh.
He suggests that in our imperfect world, consciously cultivating the ability to do without happiness might actually give you the best shot at achieving some measure of it.
How does that work?
Because it can free you from constant anxiety about fortune, about losing things you might not get anyway, a bit like the Stoics maybe. It gives you a kind of inner resilience. But again, the ultimate justification isn't the resilience itself, but that this state of mind might better enable actions that do promote general happiness.
Got it. So sacrifice is okay, even noble, but only when it serves the greater good. All right, next objection. Utilitarianism sets an impossibly high standard. Does it really mean we have to be constantly calculating the greatest good for all humanity before, choosing what sandwich to have for lunch?
Hey, yeah, Mill heard that one too. He says this fundamentally confuses the rule of action with the motive behind the action.
Okay, explain that difference.
Ethics, Mill argues, gives us a test, a standard to judge whether an action is right or wrong. That's the principle of utility. But it doesn't say that the only reason or feeling you should ever have when acting is this grand concern for the general good or a sense of duty.
So my motive can be something else entirely.
Absolutely. Mill says the vast majority of our actions, even good actions, are done from other motives: love for specific people, wanting a good reputation, habit, personal interest, whatever. And that's completely fine.
As long as
the action itself doesn't violate the rule, as long as it doesn't tend to produce more unhappiness than happiness overall. He says the morality of the action depends on the intention, what you actually choose and mean to do, not the motive, the feeling that prompted you.
Okay, that makes it much more practical. So when do I need to think about the general good?
Mainly when your actions are likely to have wide-ranging consequences, affecting society broadly, or when you're involved in setting rules or policies. For most everyday good deeds, helping a friend, being kind to a stranger, the focus is naturally on the well-being of the individuals involved.
As long as you're not, violating someone's rights in the process.
Exactly. And those rights, as we'll get to, are themselves grounded in general utility. So the motive usually isn't the issue for judging the action's rightness.
That distinction feels really important. It's about the likely results, not needing to have perfectly pure, society-focused thoughts all the time. Okay, one more for now. Objection 4, utilitarianism, makes people cold, calculating, unsympathetic. It ignores the importance of having a good character.
Mill pushes back on this too. He says, first, if the complaint is that utilitarians judge actions by their consequences rather than by the goodness of the person doing them, well, every moral system does that.
Right. A good person can still do a wrong action, and vice versa.
Precisely. No ethical standard says an action is right because a good person did it. The action is judged on its own merits according to the standard.
So character is important, but it's assessed separately from the rightness of a specific act.
That's Mill's view. Our assessment of the person's character is crucial, but it's distinct from assessing the action. Utilitarians absolutely value good character, things like kindness, honesty, courage. Why?
Because good character leads to good actions.
Exactly. They believe the best proof of good character is a consistent tendency to perform actions that promote happiness. And while they acknowledge other desirable human qualities, a character oriented towards utility is seen as the most morally important kind.
It's valuable because of its results.
Right. Now, Mill concedes that some individual people who call themselves utilitarians might become overly focused on calculation and seem cold. But he argues that's a personal failing, not a flaw inherent in the doctrine itself.
It could happen with any ethical system.
It happens with adherents of all sorts of moralities. The utilitarian theory, Mill insists, actually encourages cultivating the very character traits, empathy, benevolence, integrity, that reliably lead to good outcomes for everyone.
Okay, so we've defined it, looked at quality versus quantity, tackled some major objections. But this brings up a really fundamental question. Why should I care? Why should I feel obligated to follow this principle of utility, especially if it clashes with my own desires? What gives it its binding force, as Mill puts it, its sanction?
Right. This is the why bother question. It gets to the heart of moral motivation. Mill breaks down the forces that make any moral standard feel compelling into two types: external and internal sanctions.
Okay, let's start with external. What are those?
These are the pressures from outside ourselves, things like hope of reward or fear of punishment from other people.
Social approval or disapproval?
Exactly. Or from God, if you believe in God, hope of divine favor, fear of displeasure. It also includes things like our natural sympathy or affection for others, or feelings of awe towards a divine being, these external motivators.
And how do these apply specifically to utilitarianism?
Mill argues they can support utilitarianism just as effectively as any other moral code. People naturally want happiness for themselves, so they have an incentive to encourage utility-promoting behavior in others, which benefits them.
Makes sense. Peer pressure towards niceness.
Basically, yeah. And if you believe God is good, it seems logical that God would approve of actions that maximize the happiness of his creatures. As society gets more interconnected, these external forces pushing towards considering others' well-being naturally get stronger.
Okay, that's the outside pressure. What about the internal sanction?
That's the feeling within us. It's our conscience. That sense of duty, the pain or discomfort, maybe guilt or remorse we feel when we violate what we believe to be right.
And is this feeling unique to utilitarianism? Does it feel different?
Not at all, according to Mill. He says it's the same subjective feeling that provides the binding force for any moral standard someone genuinely adopts. Whether your standard is religious law, Kantian duty, or utility, the internal feeling of obligation, the ouch of conscience when you break it, is fundamentally similar.
So the real question isn't if there's an internal sanction, but where does that feeling come from? Is it innate, built in?
That's the core issue. And Mill's answer is pretty firm. He believes it's acquired, it's not innate.
Learned then.
Learned and developed. He compares it to other complex human abilities, like building cities or speaking languages. We have the raw potential for moral feelings and natural capacity, but it gets shaped and developed through experience, through education, through social influence, and crucially, through association linking certain actions with feelings of pleasure or pain, approval or disapproval.
Okay, if it's acquired, what's the natural basis for it? What raw material within us gets shaped into a utilitarian conscience? What makes us feel inclined to promote general happiness?
Mill identifies the foundation as our social feelings, the basic human desire to be in unity with our fellow creatures.
Wanting to belong, to connect.
Exactly. He sees this as a powerful, natural tendency in humans, one that actually gets stronger as civilization progresses and we become more interdependent. Living in society, especially a society where people see each other more or less as equals, forces us to consider others' interests. It's just a practical necessity for cooperation.
You can't function purely selfishly in a group.
Pretty much. As we live and work together, we start to identify our own interests with the interests of the group or others around us. Our feelings become tied up with their well-being, this growing sense of unity, combined with our natural capacity for sympathy, and reinforced by all those external factors like education and public opinion.
That becomes the internal sanction.
That becomes the powerful internal binding force for utilitarian morality. It makes caring about the general good feel like a natural part of who we are, something essential to our social existence, something we wouldn't really want to be without because it's so tied to our connection with others.
That grounds it really nicely in just being human and living together.
Hey.
Okay, but now the really big question. How do you prove that happiness is the ultimate goal? The only thing desirable for its own sake? Mill acknowledges this is tough.
Yeah, he's upfront about it. Questions about ultimate ends, like is happiness good or is health good? You can't prove them in the usual sense, like a geometric theorem or a scientific law.
You can't logically deduce it from something more basic.
Exactly. So how does he approach trying to prove the principle of utility? He turns to psychology and observation.
What people actually do.
Right. He says the only evidence you can possibly give that something is desirable is that people actually do desire it.
Okay, seems plausible.
So, step 1, observe. Do people desire happiness? Mill says, yes, absolutely. As an undeniable fact of human nature, any person desires their own happiness.
Fair enough.
Therefore, he concludes, happiness is a good to that person. And if each person's happiness is a good to them, then the general happiness must be a good to the aggregate of all persons.
Okay, so that establishes happiness as at least one good, one end of action, and therefore a criterion for morality.
Correct. But the big challenge is showing it's the sole criterion. What about all the other things people seem to desire for their own sake, like virtue, or money, power, fame? People clearly desire those things, sometimes intensely.
Yeah, that seems like a problem for the theory. If we desire virtue for itself, isn't that an end separate from happiness?
Mill agrees people do desire virtue, and other things, for their own sake. This is where his theory of association becomes absolutely critical.
How does association explain this?
He argues that things originally desired only as a means to happiness can, through constant association with the pleasure they bring or the pain they prevent, come to be desired as a part of happiness itself.
Okay, can you give an example?
Money is the classic one. Initially, you want money only for the things that can buy things that bring pleasure or prevent pain. But through constant association, the miser comes to desire the money itself. Possessing the money becomes, for him, a direct source of pleasure, a component of his happiness.
Ah, the means becomes part of the end feeling.
Exactly. And Mill argues the same psychological process can happen with virtue. Someone might initially cultivate virtue because it leads to good consequences, approval, self-respect, avoiding punishment. But over time, the conscious practice of virtue can become inherently pleasurable. Being virtuous feels good in itself. It becomes desired not just as a tool to get happiness, but as an ingredient within their conception of a happy life.
So the desire for virtue isn't separate from happiness. It gets absorbed into the desire for happiness.
That's Mill's claim. He argues that when you really analyze it, people desire nothing ultimately except things that are either inherently pleasant, part of happiness, or are means to producing pleasure or preventing pain. Even things like virtue or money, when desired for themselves, are desired because they have become associated with and incorporated into the person's feeling of happiness.
So this psychological observation that we only desire happiness or things connected to it is his proof.
It's the only kind of proof he believes is possible for an ultimate principle. It's an empirical claim about human motivation based on self-reflection and observing others. He says, look inside, look around. This is how human desire actually works. And if happiness is the sole thing ultimately desired, it must be the sole criterion for judging actions.
That's a fascinating way to ground it in experience. Okay, let's tackle the final really big piece of the puzzle, justice. This often feels like the Achilles heel for utilitarianism. Justice feels different.
Absolute. Violating justice seems wrong in a way that goes beyond just calculating overall happiness. Absolutely. This is probably the most powerful objection, the feeling that justice is somehow sacred and distinct from mere expediency or utility. Mill knew he had to address this thoroughly. His aim isn't to dismiss justice, but to show that our strong feelings about it and the idea itself are actually grounded on utility, but a very specific, very important kind of utility.
So where does he start? How do we identify what we mean by unjust?
He looks at common examples. Things we typically call unjust include violating someone's legal rights or their moral rights, things they ought to have even if not legally codified.
Like freedom of speech, maybe?
Could be. Also, denying someone what they deserve, good or bad, breaking faith or promises, being partial or biased when impartiality is expected, and promoting inequality unless it's clearly beneficial for society overall.
Okay. A common thread seems to be someone being wrong, someone's claim being ignored.
Exactly. Mill points out that all these involve the idea of a right belonging to a specific individual or group, and that right being violated.
And how does he connect this idea of wrongness to duty or punishment?
He draws a link. We consider an action wrong if we think the person ought to be punished for it in some way, whether by law, by social condemnation, or at least by their own conscience. A moral duty, for Mill, is something that society or conscience can rightly exact from a person. You can be held accountable.
This helps distinguish real moral wrongs from just, like, impoliteness.
Yes, or from actions that are merely inexpedient but don't violate a duty. He also makes that distinction between duties of perfect obligation and imperfect obligation.
Remind us what that is again.
Duties of perfect obligation are those where there is a specific person or people who has a corresponding right to your performance of that duty. Like repaying a debt, the creditor has a right to the money. Justice, Mill says, deals primarily with these perfect obligations. When injustice occurs, someone's specific right has been violated.
And imperfect obligations.
Are things like charity or benevolence. You ought to be charitable, perhaps, but no specific person has a right to demand your charity at a particular time. Justice isn't typically involved there.
Okay, so injustice involves violating rights, which are tied to perfect duties. But where does that incredibly strong feeling come from? That outrage we feel at injustice, it feels primal.
Mill traces the sentiment of justice back to two very basic natural impulses. The instinct for self-defense or self-preservation.
Wanting to protect ourselves.
Right. And the feeling of sympathy, our ability to feel with others. It starts with the natural urge to retaliate or resent harm done to ourselves or those we care about through sympathy.
Like an animal defending its territory or young?
Kind of, yes. But it becomes moralized in humans. That raw feeling of resentment gets expanded and refined by our intellect and our capacity for general sympathy.
How does intellect change it?
Our intellect allows us to see that an injury isn't just personal. Harm done to anyone poses a threat to the security of society as a whole, which we depend on. So we resent harm done to others because it indirectly threatens us and the social order. And our general sympathy lets us feel that resentment for others, not just ourselves.
So, the intense feeling is basically this primal urge for retaliation, but broadened by sympathy and guided by the understanding that we need social order.
That's Mill's analysis of the sentiment. He says its moral quality comes from being subordinated to our social sympathies and acting only in ways that align with the general good. We resent injuries not just because they hurt, but because they are the kind of injuries that society has a profound interest in preventing for everyone's sake.
So if justice is about rights and rights should be defended by society, why should society defend them, according to Mill? What's the ultimate justification?
Back to the core principle, general utility.
But there's that tension again. Utility feels, calculating, justice feels absolute. How does he bridge that gap? Why does this particular utility feel so much stronger?
This is key. Mill explains the intensity by pointing to the kind of utility involved. Justice is fundamentally concerned with security. Yes. Personal security, security of property, security of expectations based on promises. Mill argues security is the most vital interest we have. It's the absolute foundation for everything else. Without a basic level of security, you can't pursue any other goods, you can't plan for the future, you can't be free from constant fear. It's essential for human flourishing.
So because security is so incredibly important, its utility is off the charts.
Exactly. The utility of maintaining security is so immensely high, so fundamental to all other aspects of well-being, that the moral rules protecting it, which we call justice, feel incredibly stringent. And the feelings associated with it, the demand for it, the resentment when it's violated, are far more intense than feelings about ordinary matters of expediency or inconvenience.
The difference in importance feels like a difference in kind.
That's how it registers psychologically. It feels absolute, set apart, because its utility is paramount.
Okay, one final point on this. If justice is based on utility, how does that help when different ideas of justice seem to conflict, like in debates about punishment or fair wages?
This is where Mill thinks utility proves its worth. He points out that people often appeal to different conflicting maxims of justice. Is it just to punish, to deter others, or only based on what the offender deserves? Is it just to pay people based on effort or need or market value? These principles can clash.
And utility provides a way to decide.
Mill argues it provides the only rational standard. When principles of justice conflict, we should appeal to general utility. Which rule or policy in this situation will best promote the overall security and well-being of everyone affected? Utility acts as the umpire between competing justice claims.
So he's not throwing justice out. He's saying it's the name we give to the most essential moral rules, the ones protecting the most vital utility security, and that's why they feel so absolute, and why utility is needed to resolve conflicts within justice itself.
Precisely. Justice concerns the essentials of human well-being. These rules have paramount obligation because their social utility is so incredibly high. The intense feeling comes from our natural resentment, moralized and directed by social needs, and the supreme importance of security.
Wow. Okay, that really ties it all together. We started with the basic idea, happiness is pleasure and no pain. Saw Mill refine it with the crucial idea of quality of pleasure. Watched him defend it against major objections like unattainability or demandingness. Understood how he grounded the feeling of obligation in our social nature and conscience.
Provided that unique psychological proof based on what we actually desire.
And finally showed how even our powerful, seemingly separate sense of justice can be understood as rooted in the most fundamental type of utility, security. It's quite a comprehensive picture he paints.
He really aimed to show utilitarianism wasn't just some abstract formula, but a practical standard, informed by human psychology and the lessons learned over history, embodied in secondary moral rules.
A standard based on maximizing flourishing for everyone.
Looking at the real impact on well-being, broadly understood.
It's definitely a framework that's had a massive impact on ethics ever since. So for you, listening,
Right.
here's the final thought to take away. If the ultimate measure of right and wrong is this principle of promoting the greatest happiness quality included, security paramount for the greatest number, how might thinking through that lens change your perspective on a complex moral issue you're grappling with?
Whether in personal life or society.
Right. If maximizing overall well-being is the ultimate goal, what actions, what priorities, what societal changes does that principle seem to point towards as being most important, and why?
Definitely something worth mulling over.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism.